I'm Dr. Andy Kaufman, recovering physician, plandemic whistleblower, natural healing pedagogue, and legal code talker. You can call me the Truth Doctor. I'm here to shift your paradigm as I perform a radical forensic dissection, discerning fact from fiction, science from pseudoscience, medicine from poison, law from legal fiction, and individualism from collectivism. This is your channel for unraveling the truth about health and science. This is the Healthy Living Livestream. Now, in my natural healing research and experience, I've come across coffee enemas. And originally, I learned about this from the Gerson Institute and the Gerson Protocol. And there is tons of evidence from their treatment that coffee enemas, along with juicing, can help many, many people cure themselves completely of cancer and other diseases. And of course, we saw all the health benefits related to liver disease. So, coffee enemas are unique because we are delivering the healing substances in the coffee directly to the liver. And this occurs through veins in our colon that communicate directly with the liver in what's known as the hepatic portal circulatory system. And so these particular substances, and there are some that have been recognized as being important in this process, like cafestol and palmitate, have a variety of beneficial effects on the liver to help it further detoxify itself and improve and optimize its functioning. However, when we look at the literature, we cannot find any clinical studies or evidence whatsoever looking at the benefit of coffee enemas, even though from other sources we see tons and tons of evidence. But instead, we see papers like I'm going to show you on this next slide, which looks at the safety of self-administered coffee enemas. It really says nothing about the effectiveness because there are no published studies looking at that. But here, what they found is a total of 9 case reports where something bad happened and the patient happened to use a coffee enema, sometimes just a single coffee enema. Now, just in my True Living Fellowship community, I think there are more than 9 people doing coffee enemas at present, and there has not been one reported adverse effect. And I'll read what they say based on these 9 individuals in regards to safety, based on acceptable quality of evidence. And these are all case reports, so that's very low quality. This systematic review revealed the risk of adverse events caused by the self-administration of coffee enema, which mostly include rectal burns and colitis. Now, many of these patients already had colitis, so it's kind of funny that they blame it on the coffee. And rectal burns, happen from someone not realizing that coffee is hot. And I don't think that this has anything to do with the practice of coffee enemas, because no matter what medical procedure we're talking about, somebody can make a mistake. Even with a routine injection, it can be accidentally injected into a blood vessel. The needle can hit the bone. So if someone is foolish enough to put steaming hot coffee, into their rectum, I think they essentially deserve what's coming to them, but we cannot blame the coffee enemas for this problem. Now, if we look at just colonic irrigation, also, which is similar to water enemas, there is more volume, and it's also similar to coffee enemas because we're essentially putting fluid into the colon to wash it out. On the next slide, there is an article published in 1932, because you'll also see almost no literature on enemas, other than perhaps for constipation. But here, this trial was done in a mental hospital for patients with schizophrenia, which they used to call dementia precox, and psychotic depression. Now, these are two of the most difficult psychiatric illnesses to treat with modern treatment approaches. In fact, schizophrenia is universally said to be incurable and lifelong and just requires management. And psychotic depression is the most difficult form of depression to treat successfully and the most severe. So I'll read the quote here. After treating patients in each of these groups by colon irrigation, he reports that of his dementia precox cases, 17% recovered. So almost 1/5 of people with schizophrenia recovered just from colonics. Of his psychotically depressed patients, 70% recovered. That's miraculous, miraculous. And psychoneurosis, 80%. So that's anxiety. So of the total cases, all groups, 40% recovered, 33% improved, and 50%, 7% were released on visit. Now, this would blow away any mental institution today. Couldn't be anywhere near that, because they can't have these kinds of results and are unable to cure anyone with schizophrenia. So if we combine the health benefits of coffee with the health benefits of colonics, we should realize tremendous health improvement. And on my last slide here, I will highlight some of these issues. So if we look at the research on coffee enemas, there are no clinical studies published. The case reports talking about rectal burns are very misleading, and you can dissect that paper yourself. There are several editorials that claim it's useless and dangerous without actually any evidentiary basis. Enemas have been used for quite a long time historically, and time has honored their continued use. Coffee has been universally shown to benefit the liver. The chemicals can help dilate the bile ducts and allow stones and sludge to drain. And there's a reduction in fatty liver disease, cirrhosis, and hepatocellular cancer. And of course, we have the data of success from all of the Gerson therapy clients who have survived cancer and many other serious life-threatening health conditions. So all in all, we see that the story that we may have been told about the risks of coffee does not pan out in the actual research. And it really can be considered a health food, a health drink, or even a superfood of sorts for all those people who are not exquisitely sensitive to the stimulatory effects of caffeine. And sticking to between 2 and 6 cups a day will maximize all the potential health benefits without any risk of harm. So if you're a coffee drinker, or if you switched from coffee thinking it was not good for you to something else, now I think you have the evidence that it's okay to resume your coffee habit, and that most likely it will be beneficial for you. Diabetes is kind of defined as an alteration in your body's ability to manage its blood sugar levels. Those are the levels of glucose, essentially the body's main sugar, and it converts other dietary sugars into glucose. And how it regulates the levels in your blood, because from the blood, they would get taken up by the tissues to undergo carbohydrate metabolism. And this is regulated by a hormone, insulin. I'm sure many of you know this, and this is kind of a review. But insulin is secreted by the pancreas. And when blood sugar comes in from, our diet or other sources into the blood, and it directs in the blood to essentially go inside the cells to be taken up and leave the blood, or to stay in the blood. And it also, of course, has regulatory abilities over fat storage and is related to our weight, stature, and obesity as well. And when you develop type 2 diabetes, it is said to be due to insulin resistance, where the body does not respond to insulin in terms of taking blood sugar up into the cells. And that leaves the blood sugar in, the sugar in the blood at higher levels, where it becomes toxic to other organs and tissues. And those lead to complications of diabetes, such as peripheral vascular disease, vision loss, blindness, heart attacks, strokes, and all the many other issues that we know happens over time related and associated with diabetes. So I'm not going to give the specific numbers that define, whether it's pre-diabetes or diabetes, because those change over time and are not really important. The important thing is that there is dysregulation in this system. And of course, that leads to various types of interventions, mostly with pharmaceuticals, which don't really change any of the underlying issues. So let's look at how many people are affected by diabetes. And also, let me say that those complications lead to a lot of disability and death. And those numbers are quite staggering as well. We're not going to look at them specifically today. But Alexander, if you want to bring up the first slide, and this is a large study that was done. And interestingly, it was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I'll let you conclude what the relevance of that is. But if we can look at the trend in the next slide. So what they did is they looked at the prevalence, which is how many people in any given moment suffer from a condition. In this case, it's diabetes type 1 and type 2. And this is global. So this is worldwide. I mean, not every single country, but they surveyed quite a number of countries in this study. And you can see they looked at actual data from 1990 at the left side of the graph up until 2020. And then after that, it's essentially a prediction or an extrapolation of the trend line, and you can see where it's going. So as of 2020, you can see that the prevalence is somewhere between 5 and 7.5%. And this is worldwide. And you can see the trend that there is a fairly sharp rise. And I want you to try to remember the shape of this graph, because we're going to look at some other graphs that have very similar shapes over the same time period of 1990 to 2020. And you can see here by 2050 that it's predicted to be 10% of the world population suffering from diabetes. Now, in the United States, we're actually ahead of the global curve here, and we're already at very close to 10%. So 1 in 10 Americans suffer from diabetes. Now, you can see also on this chart that there is a slight increase in type 1 diabetes, the red line on the bottom, but it is not nearly as dramatic as the rise in type 2. And if we looked at type 2 trends for different age groups, we would see a remarkable increase in young people, especially even in adolescence and pre-adolescence, where previously that was never really seen at all. So this is quite a prevalent and important condition. We all know people who have been diagnosed with diabetes. So I would think there would be considerable effort to try and find the cause, or that the cause would be known. And I wonder if many of you out there think that the actual cause is known, that it's just by too much sugar or carbohydrates in your diet. However, when you start to look around the internet, you will find virtually all the websites. So, the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, the American Diabetes Association, the Centers for Disease Control, where they'll all have sections on their webpage that says what causes diabetes. And then in there, they won't list the cause. Now, in some places, like in the American Diabetic Association, they readily admit that the cause is unknown. according to science. But many of the other sites will just list risk factors, and those are really just statistical covariates, so that there's some correlation or association, but it doesn't tell you anything about the causal relationship. So, for example, there's a high correlation between diabetes and obesity, right? But does obesity cause diabetes? Does diabetes cause obesity? Or is there a common cause that leads to both factors? And that is the kind of missing part. But they definitely, even if it was obesity that caused diabetes, then you'd have to say, well, what's causing obesity? Because it's not just eating more. If you look at the trends, that's not doesn't explain it. So we have, basically the literature just reporting risk factors, which maybe help you predict if you'll develop diabetes, but they offer no explanation about the underlying cause. We all know that oil and water do not mix when we've tried to put them together. In fact, many of the cleaning agents like surfactants and dishwashing detergents act specifically to emulsify the fats to allow them to be compatible in the water and be rinsed away, like when we have greasy dishes or grease stains on our clothing for the laundry. So we're kind of familiar with this aspect. And I want you to kind of imagine how sometimes these grease stains set in and are very hard to remove. And we're going to see that the same thing happens in our body with these greasy, toxic substances. So the basis of this property that oil and water stay separate is because of their polarity. And this is a way of looking at particular substances or molecules of how the charge is distributed in that molecule. So, of course, they could be ionic and actually carry a charge, in which case those are mostly for very polar substances, right? Because they have two poles of charge, right? The charge is kind of separated across the molecule in some way. And then we have nonpolar substances, and those have a more even charge distribution, and those are the oily, fat soluble type of substances. So how does this affect toxins in the environment or that we're exposed to? So a number of ways. So firstly, and we can take the slide down for now, many of these substances that are fat soluble persist in the environment. In other words, through exposure to natural elements like being ingested by animals and microorganisms, also being exposed to ultraviolet light, etc., do not degrade these substances. They are persistent organic pollutants, is the industry or the scientific term from environmental toxicology that describes many of these substances. So because they persist for such a long time, this in itself is problematic. For example, PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which are one of these types of compounds, were rendered illegal for use in industrial products in 1977. However, in the present day, in the 2020s, they have been shown in research to still persist in biological organisms, right? So some 50 years almost after they were made illegal and stopped being put in products. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of how persistent some of these chemicals are. Now, there are two other aspects that are very important to relate to their toxicity, and they have to do with the fat solubility aspect, because fat soluble chemicals will tend to accumulate in our tissues, in our fatty tissues, and this is known as bioaccumulation. So in other words, when they enter our body, they're, rather than being removed, they're stored in the fatty tissues, and they accumulate over time. Now, this is compounded when we take a step out and look at the ecosystem or the food chain. If you could bring up that next slide, there's an additional property called biomagnification. Sorry, it's the one after that. Yeah, there you go. So we'll go back to that previous slide. So here we can see a graphical representation of this process, and the little, I believe there, with 4 dots, the plus signs in there represent the bioaccumulation of these fat-soluble or lipophilic toxins. And you could see on the bottom of the food chain is the grass, or the plants, and that's eaten by rodents. And you could see that there's some small level in the plants, and then the rodents have a higher level. And then when we go up the food chain, you could see that with each higher predator, there is an increase or magnification of the levels of these toxins. And since humans are on the very top of the food chain, we would have among the highest levels according to this model. Now, if you can go back to the prior slide, Alexander, this is an example of some of the particular chemicals that are in this category. And these particular ones were part of a United Nations treaty quite a while ago, I believe in the late 90s, whereby all the signatories were reducing their use of these compounds for industrial applications because of this problem. But as you know from previous live stream programs on this topic, there is the chemical whack-a-mole phenomenon that once certain substances are identified as being harmful and toxic and removed from production, that the chemical companies and other industrial corporations simply substitute similar chemicals that are, have unknown toxicity, and put those out, like with the bisphenols, as I have discussed in detail. Now, in addition to these compounds, I think, and Alexander did mention this in his intro, it's very important to consider pharmaceuticals in this category, and especially pharmaceuticals that are used for issues said to be related to the brain. And I'm talking about psychiatric or psychotropic medications, for example, as well as medications that may be used in things like Parkinson's disease and other central neurologic disorders, because fat-soluble compounds go into the brain and are stored in the brain and in fatty tissues. So it's important to realize that many pharmaceuticals are fat-soluble. In fact, this is a challenge for the manufacturing and formulation of pills and capsules, and to ensure absorption into our body. But this is a very important category. And even if we are not taking these pills voluntarily, they're present ubiquitously in municipal drinking water. And there may be other sources as well, such as passing from mother to baby. So how do these chemicals enter our body? Well, there are several routes that they could potentially enter. In other words, through our oral ingestion, through inhalation, and of course through the skin and eyes. However, what's been shown is that these particularly lipophilic or fat-soluble toxins are predominantly absorbed through ingestion or eating. So it's very important to be careful about what you eat. Could it be contaminated with these substances? But there are still other routes that it could potentially get in, as I mentioned. But when it is ingested, these chemicals are treated by your body very much the same way as dietary fats and fat-soluble nutrients like vitamin A and D and K, for example, and which means they're taken up into the cells in your gut and put into lipoproteins, similar to cholesterol. Initially, they're called chylomicrons. And then they are essentially distributed to the appropriate places in your body, similar to how the nutrients would be, and predominantly to the liver. Researchers in the 70s did this rat park experiment, as illustrated in this series of cartoons here, where they had one group of the isolated rats, by themselves in a cage with little stimulation, and then versus a large, rat community with recreational activities and procreation, males and females mixed together, and full social groups. And they found that when they gave various solutions of morphine, that once the solution was such that the rats would take it because it was very bitter and they had to kind of sweeten it to get the rats to take it at all, that the rats in isolation took much, much more of the morphine. I think this slide reports there was a 19-fold difference. So there were factors at play besides the drug, right? Such as the environment, the social stimulation, the ability for recreation and having a normal existence. And we know rats are very social creatures. They do not live in isolation like some other animals. So there were some, skepticism to the conclusions, and this experiment was repeated several times. And depending on some details of the protocol, there were some mixed results. But overall, the trend that the animals that were exposed to socialization and other stimulation in their environment had less use of these drugs. Not that they didn't touch them at all necessarily, but much less use, and not to the point of it being to their detriment. So if we could, define rat addiction, we might say that they did not become addicted when things were pretty good in their lives. But when they were isolated and caged, then that's when they resorted to this addictive pattern for escape. Now, let's think about how that might apply to humans, because we can, first of all, just think of some examples from our common experience. But also there's some interesting data that I'll share with you. So one is simply think about, well, when we might have a traumatic injury or experience a surgical procedure, we are given, right, the same kinds of drugs that other people become addicted to. So, we're talking about drugs, and drugs are a little bit different than other things, and I will explain that a little bit later. But we don't generally become addicted to those drugs. So, I received morphine when I was in the hospital with appendicitis many years ago, and then was given a prescription for more opioids to take home. And I did not, even though I used them because of the post-operative pain, I did not become addicted to those drugs, right? So it wasn't the drug in that experience. Now, I've also worked with many individuals who have been prescribed amphetamines, like things like Ritalin and Adderall, which are mostly given to children, but also given to adults. And I have not seen this, cause addiction in those individuals. In fact, many times they were very happy to be taken off these drugs, even though we know that other people do become addicted to those particular drugs. Now, if we want to look at something a little bit more objective, we can look at the experience of Vietnam veterans, because over in Vietnam, there was a lot of access to opiates like heroin, and there was a very high prevalence of heroin use among the US soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War. And as is published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, there is follow-up interviews of those individuals, in fact, almost 400 of them, who used heroin in Vietnam to see, well, did they continue to use it as they returned to civilian life after the war? And only a small minority continued to use it. And there was a follow-up study in 2003 that actually showed that most of them already struggled with opiate addiction before even going to war. So we can see that this is further evidence that exposure to the drugs themselves is not what causes the addiction, but rather it was the dire situation they found themselves in, fighting in a war in Vietnam in a strange land with a lot of danger, that led them to use those drugs during that time. But when they returned to their families and civilian life, there was no longer a need to rely on that type of escape. So, what are the aspects of the environment or the social life that are actually the underlying cause that predisposes people to become addicted to whatever they may be exposed to in their cultural experience? So there are a number of factors here, and I don't think we can pin it down to one very, very specific thing. But let me start by reading a quote from Gabor Mate, and he's a psychiatrist from Canada who's pretty famous and has written some excellent books. And he is the first one that really made sense to me in explaining what's going on with addiction, that was distinct from, the official teachings I received in psychiatry. So here's the quote: "Not all addictions are rooted in abuse or trauma, but I do believe they can all be traced to painful experience. A hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. It is present in the gambler, the internet addict, the compulsive shopper, and the workaholic. The wound may not be as deep and the ache not as excruciating, and it may even be entirely hidden, but it's there. As we'll see, the effects of early stress or adverse experiences directly shape both the psychology and the neurobiology of addiction of the brain." Now, I have to say that my experience in psychiatry and in my personal life backs this up, that I did not encounter anyone with serious addictive behaviors who had good relationships and good career and was well adjusted to their social situation. There was always some form of turmoil or hurt or pain, and trauma certainly was highly prevalent, but not the only aspect. So, Alexander, if we could bring up the next slide, this a study looked at people with internet addiction, okay, which is really social media most likely. However, what they were looking at is specifically loneliness. Now, I have to caution you that when we don't have a gold standard test for loneliness or for internet addiction, these are subjective questionnaires with certain statistical properties. So we have to take all of this with a slight grain of salt, but it is significant here. So what they did is they reviewed all the published studies which looked at loneliness as a risk factor. And if we can go to the next slide, here is a forest plot because they did a meta-analysis, and each one of the dots represents one of the studies they incorporated into the analysis, and everything to the right of the solid line shows a strong relationship or a relationship between loneliness and internet addiction, and there's no relationship with the dots to the left of the line. And you can see that the overwhelming majority of studies showed a significant effect of loneliness and addiction, or correlation. And you can see this particular statistics in the effect line, and that dashed line is the mean or median effect size. So you can see it's quite significant to the right overall, and this gives us a nice empirical clue from some epidemiological observations. But I would say that it's not specifically just loneliness, but it is some disruption in our social needs of some form. So I've seen factors such as social anxiety, social isolation, and trauma that affects the ability to have relationships. So not just trauma per se, but the resulting social deficits and dysfunction from the effect of the trauma beyond the experience of it. Now, just to mention about isolation, we can look at the pandemic over the past few years, because when the lockdown commenced, right, we experienced isolation. We couldn't go out and do the things that we normally did to be part of a community. And we saw, of course, purposely, I believe, the liquor stores, the cannabis dispensaries were kept open. And we saw spikes, in addictive behavior, but not just with substances, right? Also with social media and internet use, pornography, all of those things, and also an increase in suicide and overdoses. And we know that actually these same kinds of stressors involving social turmoil also are independent suicide risk factors, such as social isolation, loneliness, and even addiction itself is a major suicide risk factor. So this is definitely something to consider. So the first problem that I want to bring up is the difficulty of determining what are the normal values or the reference range of a particular test. And this occurs, to all kinds of tests, including imaging studies. But it's more easy to understand when we're talking about normal lab values. So in other words, a blood test is said to be normal between 10 and 15. But what does that actually mean, and how is it determined? So one thing to consider is, to make this determination, generally the formula or recipe is to perform the test on a sample population. However, there are a number of factors to consider when you're setting up the sample population. One is that operating conditions may be different at different locations. There could be non-standardized ways of selecting who's a healthy patient, because there is no fully objective and reproducible way to designate people from the general population who's healthy and who's not healthy. Although I'm going to teach you my opinion and philosophy about that approach at the end of this discussion. Patient populations are different. In one area, you may have people of a different culture, different race, different economic status, different lifestyle. They may be living near different types of industries that may be exposed to pollution, which may alter their test results. Climate, altitude, barometric pressure, humidity, time zone, the way the sample is collected and prepared. So all of these factors can influence the results. Now, with respect to using a sample population, how many people do we include in the sample population? And of course, there's no objective standard, but there are different consensus standards. So one group, the NCCLS, recommends at minimum of 120 subjects, but other experts recommend a minimum of 200, and there are certainly more opinions even than that. So once we have a sample population and we choose an arbitrary number of people and have arbitrary determinants that those are healthy people in that area, what do we do with the results to determine what the normal range is? Well, what's done is a statistical analysis. And this is essentially a mathematical model rather than an actual real life determinant of what's occurring in nature. And whether it's done parametrically or non-parametrically, and that those words are just for the statisticians out there, generally 95% of the normal values is what's considered the normal range. So by definition, when they have an opinion about the normal ranges and state those by lab determination, they don't include 5% of people who are actually normal. So when you get your result, how do you know if you're within that 5% where you have a quote unquote abnormal result, but it actually represents a normal state of health with respect to that lab test. And these can be called false positives or false negatives, depending on which direction they're false. And a false positive value is when the test produces a positive result in someone who does not have the health condition. And a false negative is when someone has the condition, but the test produces a negative or normal result. Now, even though there are these many perils with using a statistical model to determine the normal range, not all tests are done by this. Many normal ranges are determined by consensus. And the bodies that determine these consensus normal values may not even be official medical professionals. For example, the reference ranges for blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C, which are both related to diabetes, are determined by the American Diabetic Association, which is a private non-for-profit organization. And of course, it's very subjective because, how do you obtain a consensus? I'm sure that they didn't ask every single doctor and medical scientist on the planet, right? It's just among their select group, it's considered a consensus. So we see that just the issue of determining what are the normal values is fraught with many, many errors, biases, and is not based on the reality or scientific observation of nature, but rather mathematical modeling, people's opinions, and consensus. Now, before the normal values are formally determined, a test, in order to be used, must have some kind of scrutiny or studies that show that it's a valid test, or so you would think. Now, for a diagnostic test to gain approval from the FDA in order to be licensed and sold under the FDA, of course, the first step is to perform what's called a validation study. And a validation study is simply a way to determine, does this test actually measure what it's claimed to measure? And if we could bring up the first slide, Alexander. Sorry, I'm going to put this on my screen here so I can read it more clearly. So here's a flow chart that describes the classic standard way to perform a validation study. And you can see that you have at the top a new index test, and all of the patients or participants undergo the new test, which is the one that you're trying to validate, and the gold standard, which is the gold standard way of assessing that particular diagnosis. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to use this procedure to validate the PSA test, the prostate specific antigen, which is a very commonly used screening test for prostate cancer. The gold standard for prostate cancer would be a prostate biopsy, and more specifically, a sextant biopsy, where they take they divide the prostate into 6 sections and take a piece from each section, and then determine under a microscope if there is cancer. And that may actually not even be the gold standard, because really you'd have to follow that individual over time and see if the tumor grows and becomes invasive, but will accept the biopsy. So you would have to compare the prostate specific antigen or PSA test to actual biopsies of cancer and determine how it correlates in order to validate a PSA test. So it's pretty self-explanatory. In other words, you have to show that it actually measures what it's claimed to measure, and you do that by comparing it to the gold standard.